we have been busy today, Camilla, running around London. It started not that early, about 10:30, with Kemi Badenoch's speech in King's Cross in north central London.
I call myself a net zero skeptic. Modelled plans, unrealistic targets and deadlines, over-reliance on China. We have got to start acknowledging what is in plain sight. Net zero makes us dangerously dependent on countries who don't share our values, and it is risking our energy security. It is time to stop pretending everything will be fine. Net zero by 2050 is impossible. I don't say that with pleasure. I want a better future and a better environment for our children, but we have to get real. Anyone who has done any serious analysis knows it cannot be achieved without a significant drop in our living standards, or worse, by bankrupting us.
Kamal, we are in the heart of London's Silicon Valley. We're in King's Cross. We both got nosebleeds. We've had to come north from our Victoria Westminster patch to hear Kemi Badenoch talk about her first sort of policy plan, and that involves her basically turning her back on net zero by 2050. She says it's impossible, it was an arbitrary target that couldn't be met, it's costing the public far too much money. What did you make of the speech?
I think politically it's a very good subject for the Conservatives to move on. I remember that we did a podcast from the Conservative Party conference all about how do the Conservatives make an argument about the environment that isn't about net zero, which is very, very controversial. Heat pump targets, electric vehicle targets, the price of energy, whether you should be obliged by the state to replace your cooker. All these things the voters don't like because you're trying to beat the market and tell people what to buy. And she laid out proposals today which I think are much closer to what I would describe as Conservative principles, which is all about looking after the countryside, leaving a country that is better for your children. I thought, as you were saying, Camilla, quite smart to bring in her children and the way that they were living. She was quite warm.
I thought it was quite Thatcherish to kind of position herself not just as Tory leader, but somebody who has got children and is thinking of their future.
I'm certainly not debating whether climate change exists. It does. I badly want to leave a much better environmental inheritance for my children and for yours. And on my side, I do everything I can to make sure that I reduce my impact on the environment. I don't buy many clothes for my children. They will tell you this. They do a lot of recycling.
I quite like the whole legacy, part of Thatcher's appeal was this idea that she wasn't just Prime Minister or leader, she was also a mum, she was managing a household budget. I thought Kemi Badenoch was shrewd to speak in very simple language. She kept on saying, let me just explain it for you, or let me give you an example, and it was something that I think the electorate could really sort of get a grip on, how she was saying that this net zero target by 2050 is actually the antithesis of what you need to do to have clean energy and cheaper energy.
It was quite smart. As she was speaking, we were in the auditorium and she was putting up graphs about how much energy costs had gone up. Then she did quite a thing which caused a bit of a gasp in the audience when she put up how much of our energy infrastructure is provided by China.
Yes.
And how at risk and exposed we are in green energy development to China.
Take solar panels. The good news is that costs have dropped in the last decade. Here's the less good news. 10 years ago, we were heavily dependent on China for all of the key components. Today, we're even more dependent. Look at the top dozen makers of solar panels. They are nearly all Chinese. That's an extraordinary dependency, given what we learned during COVID about over-reliance on these supply chains. What about wind farms? Where do we think that most production is currently? You guessed it, China. Which means that they are all produced using Chinese energy. 60% of their supply comes from coal-fired power stations. They are building a new one every other week to keep up with our demand.
I think that this policy area is a place where there is a dividing line with Labour, because one of the most unpopular cabinet ministers is Ed Miliband. Some of the most unpopular policies are the net zero policies. So the Conservatives, rather than trying to fight the government on things like benefits, which we've been talking about, they're trying to fight on ground where they can win as Conservatives, because What you're getting from Labour at the moment, this big shift rightwards, is they're trying to eat part, at least, of Kemi Badenoch's lunch. And not to beat the metaphor to death too much, Kemi Badenoch needs to find some new lunches to eat, and net zero is one of them.
Also on China, I think that's a really good attack line for the Conservatives. You've got reform sort of at sixes and sevens over its own foreign policy beliefs, not least because of Nigel Farage's prevarication on whether or not President Zelensky in Ukraine is a dictator or not, according to Trump, Vance and others. On that China issue, that would really cut through with the public to say, hang on a minute, this is madness. We want solar panels, according to Ed Miliband. We want to be concreting over the countryside with a load of wind farms. We want electric vehicles. All this does is embolden China to produce the materials that we need to try and be greener here, even though they're doing that with coal-fired power stations. The public really understands that argument, but I would take it further. It was interesting, she didn't mention the human rights abuses that are required by the Communist Party in China to get these parts made. You know, we're talking about the Uyghurs who have been the victim of some sort of horrific sort of genocide for recent years, being involved in slave labour. So she could take it even further and point out the hypocrisy of good old Labour, who are meant to be all cuddly and furry and loving human rights, actually perpetuating this torture of people over in China. She could have pushed it a little bit further, but I think that whole point on China connects also, of course, Labour. They're trying to allow this super embassy in London. David Lammy's perfectly relaxed about it because apparently it's in the interests of Beijing. Again, there's a chink in the armour there that they could exploit.
And where was the last country that Ed Miliband visited earlier this year? Of course, China, to sign commercial deals to bring more Chinese products here to the UK. One thing that really cheered me about today, and Camilla, you and I think, are probably in slightly different places on this, and we've discussed it. We were at the Centre for Policy Studies big event yesterday. That was the think tank that was started to support Margaret Thatcher's policy journey. Kemi Badenoch again laid out what I would describe as the Keith Joseph moment. Keith Joseph was Margaret Thatcher's policy guru who led a team, some of that within the Centre for Policy Studies, on getting deep thinking on the problems that faced the nation in the 1970s. Incredibly successful, led to the Margaret Thatcher's victory in 1979. Kemi Badenoch is trying to do the same thing. So she's going to come back with a policy commission on net zero, well, on actually our energy needs. And I think that is the right way to do politics. But your worry, Camilla, isn't it, is that it will all be too slow. And by the time she comes back to us, no one will be listening.
I mean, I think George Osborne actually on stage made one good point. I didn't think he made that many good points because he kept on suggesting that the way that she wins the next election is to chase after Liberal Democrat votes, which I think is what got them into the mess of the historic defeat of last summer. But I digress. He made one point about this lack of cut through and lack of recognisability of Kemi Badenoch and said, look, by the time we get to the next general election, everybody will know who Kemi Badenoch is. This is ridiculous. Give her time. We've discussed it. You know, we've polled you, the Telegraph audience, and you've said, look, she needs a bit more time to expand in her role. I think that's right. I mean, I liked her presentation today. I just like the way she looks. I think she looks very professional. I think she looks like she means business. I think she looks earnest. She looks fully invested in the Conservative cause. And I think that line about we're under new leadership, she keeps on repeating it because she wants it to stick. She wants people to think that they've moved on from the dark days of wet Toryism that has plagued them since, I suppose, the advent of Cameron and Osborne. One little girly insight, actually, I just wanted to share with you. So before you arrived, I was chatting here with Hamish Badenoch, who is Kemi Badenoch's husband, and he was looking in the room to find somewhere where he could sit so he wasn't in his wife's eye line. He said, she has said to me, I don't want you staring me down when I'm giving these speeches. And I looked across in this kind of, it's slightly sort of like a converted factory vibe going on here. And so Hamish was watching that whole speech from behind that pillar over there, which I just thought was an interesting insight into the lives of the Badenochs.
The more that Kemi Badenoch is humanised, I think the better it is for her. She is trying to create some momentum on the right in the policy discussion. She did the speech last night, Camilla, that you and I were at the Centre for Policy Studies debate. There was a heckle, from
she coped with them
Just Stop Oil.
Well, no,
people.
they weren't. They were just socialists.
Oh, just socialist.
They were just socialists complaining
oh, yeah, about billionaires. Yeah, sorry.
Thatcher, and basically saying Thatcher was responsible for the cost of living crisis, which is quite something
Yeah.
because she's been dead more than a decade. But there you have it.
She did deal with that well, but there she laid out something around. She laid out around foreign policy. You shouldn't give in to bullies. Actually, quite something that could have been construed as a message to Donald Trump and America and what's going on between America and Russia over Ukraine. And then we've got the speech today. So she is trying to create moments. We need to see policy. I think policy work like this is the right work to do. It's how Margaret Thatcher got into power in 1979, and it's exactly what Tony Blair did to lead the Labour Party from the wilderness of the 1980s to power in 1997.
What are we rating this out of 10? 7? In the style of Len Goodman? I don't know.
Let's be generous. Let's give her that.
I'd give her an 8. Would you just give her a 7?
I'll go for 7 at the moment. I don't want to get too heady.
All right, fine. All right, great. Shadow Foreign Secretary Priti Patel, thank you for joining us on the Daily Tea.
Pleasure.
Punchy speech, very kind of, no nonsense. She wants to change things, although... What was your overall reaction to it? Do you think this is going to cut through? She's got a problem with cut through. Is she going to cut through on this?
Well, I think absolutely. And, this is all about us, the Conservative Party in opposition. The reality is we are a party. It's about thought leadership. It's about the future direction of travel under us, for our country and for the British people. I think we do have to wake up to the reality right now, which is our country is struggling. We have a number of big challenges that are facing us. You heard a lot about energy today, the cost of energy, but other areas of policy as well, where we need to revitalise not just our thinking, but the practical approaches that we bring to our country for the British people. They're taxpayers at the end of the day. And currently, what are they paying for? Where is their money going? It's going into big institutions, bloated government, lawfare, where we have lawyers, constantly on this merry-go-round of suing the very ministers and government departments that are here to serve the country. I know because I was there. So it's important that we actually take this important step back. We reflect upon the state that we are in. That's a phrase that actually was used in the 1980s under the Thatcher government as well, when she was trying to, burnish credentials and reform Britain, change the DNA of our country to make us more productive, to bring in foreign direct investment, the revitalisation and redevelopment that we see here in King's Cross, that's vital. And I think as Conservatives, that's where we are all over again. I believe that's where we should be. I say this as someone that's been a long-standing Thatcherite Conservative. We have to think about the future. We are custodians of our party. We're also custodians of our country.
Just very quickly on that Thatcher point, as we do like to discuss Thatcher a lot on the Daily
We do,
Tea,
and Camilla has a picture of Margaret Thatcher on her desk,
And
which
I
we
know that
pray to every morning.
Only one, though.
only one picture, but you haven't seen my study at home. And I know that you're a massive fan of Thatcher. Is it fair and right to make comparisons between Margaret Thatcher and Kemi Badenoch? Has she got that Thatcher factor?
So I'd actually put this down to the substance, the situation we are in, the way in which we look to the future, but also speak about the problems that we have and how we confront them and then put forward the diagnosis. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, beyond, I don't even call myself a fan. I mean, she reformed our country. My family and my household still speak about the opportunities we've had in this country because of the reforms, the change, the revolution, basically, she spearheaded with some remarkable people. I think of them and look back of them. I still see some of them, obviously, in parts of our politics with a great deal of respect, enormous respect, because they were the ones that were battling on the front line, the battle of ideas, battling the unions at the time, bringing in institutional reform. So absolutely, there are themes here and parallels in the sense that we are battling institutions. And, basically, you've heard already this sort of collective mindset, the zeitgeist around net zero. How did we come to the situation that we are in? Or, for example, on lawfare and the fact that how has our government, successive governments, been tied up in legislation, regulation, where it's almost an act of self-harm, where we fail to even do what we said we would do and deliver for the public, the taxpayers, and, for example, get rid of illegal migrants in the way in which I and others have tried to do before. So I do think it's important. We are at this sort of turning point where we as a party have to think about the future. We're doing that. We're very driven by substance, not just slogans and platitudes, which I'm afraid you always see with the left and the Labour government. And also, vested interest groups. I mean, let's be quite clear. We've been surrounded and dominated by them in terms of activists influencing government thinking, civil service thinking, things of that nature. And that's the type of change we now need.
Now, Priti Patel, we've known each other a lot of years, and I've always enjoyed our conversations. But most of those years, Priti, you've been in government. And I was just reflecting on Kemi Badenoch's speech that she said the 2050 targets were impossible to reach and were leading to high energy costs. The three prime ministers who put in place the net zero targets were, in order, Theresa May, Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. All of them Conservative prime ministers that you served. I think, aren't the public going to be, and the voters going to be saying, well, you're to blame for all this?
So, look, first of all, I didn't serve all three of them, but I think importantly, it comes back to not having a plan. So coming back to the point that Kemi has made today, it's all very well to say this is going to be a target, but what was the behind the scenes work? What were the foundations in terms of delivering that plan? Now, you spoke about serving in those governments. There's also, as Kemi has spoken today, about something called collective responsibility. I wasn't in the relevant departments at the time on this particular theme, so I wasn't involved in all those big discussions. In the same way, Kemi wasn't until she became business secretary, but raised these concerns. The key thing is, though, you learn lessons. You learn lessons from being in government and out of government in terms of what works, quite frankly, what doesn't work as well, and how you can deliver for the British people. And I think also we have to have this enormous reality check now in terms of what is practical, what isn't practical. I do genuinely think this whole thing about heat pumps and households is something that has been topical for some time. Camilla, I've been on one of your shows in the past where we've discussed this. We're all great believers in technology, but not taxes, just to sort of drive, a means to an end. We have to be practical here. At the end of the day, the British public are not being served by these targets, and I think it's important that we as a party call this out and recognise that and find practical solutions to some of the big global international challenges such as climate change and net zero that we are trying to confront.
Did the Conservatives lose their way, that they thought that by setting targets the state could somehow trump the markets? I've always thought the Conservatives were a markets first party, and therefore it's for the market to decide, with guidance from the state and some regulation possibly, but the market will decide where we get to in the end. Isn't that, so, you lost your way on that?
So we've got, we haven't got the long time, the hours that we need to discuss this. That's a wider issue. I'm a great believer in markets. So what has happened, and it's not just about Conservative governments, it's all government, civil service as well, institutions. They are literally, the thinking is not about markets. Look at the amount of state subsidy that has gone into, this whole area of the green agenda, net zero. That was to kickstart the markets and get companies to come forward. By the way, that's been successful in the renewables area to a certain extent, but it can't be applied across the board. It's not a quick fix, and it's not a sticking plaster across all aspects of, for example, the green agenda. Now, I have championed free markets and, I believe in less regulation. I think our financial institutions have been totally straitjacketed and constrained, and we're not the home of capital markets in the way in which we used to be. For us, this is the type of glorious revolution which we are now trying to, refashion all over again in terms of new thinking, new ideas, working with the right kind of people that understand this. And I say the right people, yes, experts, rather than the activists. Some parts of government policy have been dominated by activists, and we should just recognise that and be honest about it and be upfront about it.
Priti Patel, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Daily Tea today.
Thank you.
Well, that was us in King's Cross at that launch by Kemi Badenoch of her first major policy announcement. And there's a poll running on the Telegraph website, quite interesting here, Kamal. Actually, I'm going to test you on it. When we asked readers, should the 2050 net zero target be scrapped, what percentage do you think said yes?
Of our readers?
Yeah.
Golly, I would say quite high. 70%.
89%
Wow.
to those who want to keep it 11%.
Yep.
So, look, she is speaking Telegraph language. I think we can also, shall we conclude that that's probably her strongest speech to date while opposition leader? I think it probably was, wasn't it?
I did like the stuff she did in Washington pre-Christmas,
Yes.
where she laid out her conservative philosophy and principles. I thought that was a very strong speech. It wasn't covered much. It was, I think, delivered in the evening US time, so it didn't break through much here. But I think alongside that, we are seeing some momentum.